really had to eat like every. Good afternoon, folks. We're just going to give folks just a couple minutes to trickle on in, and then we will get started. Alrighty, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our Lunch and Learn. This is the second to last Lunch and Learn of our Decolonizing Education series, as well as our second to last Lunch and Learn of 2021. I am going to go ahead and have our panelists introduce themselves, and then I will start off with Representative Gregerson, if that is okay with you. I know you have to hop off.
Sure, I'm sorry about that.
No worries.
I'm Mia Gregerson. I live in the shadow of the SeaTac Airport. I represent the 33rd Legislative District, which I basically say is South King County. Yeah, I'm really glad to be here. I'm a vice chair of the Appropriations Committee and on the State Government Tribal Relations Committee.
Thank you. And Bernal, would you like to introduce yourself? You're on mute. All right, we can come right back to you. Sumait, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure thing, thank you. And I apologize, everyone. I'm off camera because I have really spotty internet in Tukwila right now. Hashtag digital equity. Hello, everyone. My name is Sumait Mel, and I am the Director of Partners in Change, which is a program under the Equity and Education Coalition. And I'm happy to be here. I use he, him, they pronouns.
Thank you. And Bernal?
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes.
I'm sorry. This is Bernal Baca, and I'm the Executive Director of Central Latino, now Mi Centro in Tacoma. And I'm also the chair of the Racial Equity Team and the chair of the Hispanic Affairs Commission for the state of Washington.
Thank you for joining us. And Senator Saldana?
Greetings, everyone. Rebecca Saldana, State Senator of the 37th Legislative District, which includes a lot of our traditional historic communities where people land, including Central District, International Chinatown, Rainier Valley, unincorporated King County of Skyway, and downtown Renton. It's great to be with y'all. And I am she, her, they.
And Misha?
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Misha Werschful. I use she and her pronouns. I am with the Washington State Budget and Policy Center, and really excited to be in this conversation today. Hoping to have a little bit to share, but also as a learner, hearing from all of you and the other panelists about approaches to decolonizing legislative policies. So thanks. Thank
you. So I have a question for you, Representative Gregerson, and it's a big question. Is if you could imagine, what does a decolonized legislative system / process look like for you in a perfect world?
Sure. So for me, when I think about it, I really think about humanizing the policy and really thinking about who it affects, both short-term and long-term. For me, it's about, I'm very visual. So when there's a hearing or when there's opportunity to weigh in, it's who's present and who's voicing their opinions and who's not. I also think about it in the sense of government's role is to do everything that businesses have already decided that they can't make money doing. And so trying to really center the people, ground the work of who's the farthest from the microphone and trying to do that. So for me, those are my values when I think about decolonizing it. I'm sure I'm on a panel of amazing people, so a lot of people will talk about the process and how to do that.
Thank you. And kind of tagging on to that was, what are some barriers within the legislative process that cause a disconnect between legislators and the community?
I'm assuming this is all for me. So
yes.
Just let me know if you need to step back. Okay. Barriers. Well, we all know that just like in everyday life, transportation, access to the digital world, time away from work, free time, the civics, in order to feel confident enough to weigh in. I think all of those are issues related to how the process works and how we basically build infrastructure that isn't welcoming. And hopefully I answered your question.
No, that's great. Thank you. And then I also wanted to open up that the first question to the rest of the panelists is like, in a perfect world, like, how do you see the legislature decolonized? And feel free to just hop into the question. If not, I will call on you.
Okay, I'll start, I guess.
Thank you.
So I guess the perfect world, for a long time, I always wanted to live there. And then I realized it's been a lot of energy there. And so I'm like, okay, I have to be better at accepting where I am and making this the place that is getting closer to that vision. So I'll say like one thing, because I don't know when Rep. Gregerson's gonna have to jump off, but decolonizing is resisting the way the things that are the way that always they have been, and creating places for real engagement. So I mean, it's all the many meetings that happen before and a session begins, and making sure those spaces are centered on people and their real lives, and not on a timer for a minute 30 seconds. And so I think for me, it's making sure that as little as legislation is actually happening in the committee, and the real work happens in the community. And then we use the tool of a hearing to move it. But the more that the real meat of the matter is addressed before that, so that my colleagues are being brought along, engaged, but that's not where they're trying to mess with every little bit of the bill, because they aren't the experts most often on the piece of legislation that I'll say Representative Gregerson or I end up usually championing. And so the more that they recognize that the expertise is not there sitting on the dais, the more we have done our job. And so I think that is a big part of it, is decolonizing. I think the other piece, the first, really more grounding, is that the way things have always been is not any kind of thing that's the way it should be. And that decolonizing a legislative process, to me, means that we have to look at the Constitution and how problematic pieces, as much as we want to uphold it, but also is to recognize to uphold it means to make it better. And that is also where some of the fundamental anti-Black and anti-Indigenous is embedded in the Washington State Constitution. And if we can't talk about that, then we are doing ourselves a disservice about creating a more perfect world and better democracy.
I would like to add on. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Dr. Baca.
Yeah, I wanted to kind of tag on to that idea, Senator, that involving our communities, obviously something to me that's really important. And as a chair of the racial equity team, I think one of the things that I strive for and would like to see more in decolonizing our system is to have every legislative bill or go through a process of teasing it out for racial equity. And I think that it could be a pretty simple lens that could be placed on it, but I think it should be a discussion that should be held early on in the process and not later on, or as providing when we're providing data for a bill. So I think that putting that lens on at the beginning should be a critical piece to start a process of looking at every bill through a racial equity lens.
Thank you, Dr. Baca. I would also, yeah, I want to echo what Senator Saldana was talking about. When I saw the question, when I'm hearing what the question is asked, I do always struggle. I struggle between the fact that this system has been created even without BIPOC folks included. So what Senator Saldana has talked about with the Constitution, that so hits hard to home. And at the same time, like when we talk about decolonizing the state legislature, I think we need to maybe even go a little bit further upstream and think about how do we decolonize the state legislature, I'm sorry, not the legislation. We need to look at bringing more people of color into the state legislature and have more representation there. But then I'm thinking about like decolonizing legislation versus dismantling the systems. Do they go hand in hand? And how do we really rectify how that goes hand in hand and reconcile that even with our community values? Because I truly think that as we think about decolonizing within a system that we're already colonized in, it's a framework that must implode, but it's a process as well. And so I'm feeling like it also has to do with coupling decolonization with the struggle, because it will never be like a destination right now, probably not in my lifetime, but it can be a process for us to continue with. So that's what I'm thinking about in terms of when you're asking about decolonization, but also looking at the representation of power and using the levers of government, just like what the senator was talking about as well. And that includes, you know, all that we've talked about, grassroots voices. But I do want to also kind of call out that there's a difference between grassroots versus grass tops. And then there's the individuals who are hella further away from any of that, that is not even attached to any organization. And I think that's the opportunity for us to really include people to understand how we can actually take the system down like Snowpiercer, because I do think that this is a good analogy for the whole space that we're in right now, is that we're on that train. And unless we really like fight upstream and then just, for lack of better words, blow that shit up and just really start from the beginning, because this is not having any equitable outcomes for any of us. And it further puts us down into a very negative space. And that's not a good space to be in. So thank you.
I'll just add in a little. I feel like the things that I just heard named by other panelists really resonate with me, and just hearing kind of the vision that's being shared is really powerful. You know, I think that I'm someone who's kind of worked in the legislative process as an advocate for a number of years in kind of good financial times and harder financial times and just different contexts. And one of the things that's always present for me about the legislative process is a real kind of push towards kind of incremental changes. And Senator Saldana, you named that in terms of like kind of naming and then resisting the way things have always been, of, you know, this idea that like we have a system and then, you know, make a small change here and there, right? And there is power in those changes, because those changes can build to something bigger. But I think this idea of decolonizing, when I hear this and when I kind of listen and learn to what's being shared here and in other spaces, like it feels like it is really pushing back against that incremental approach, and really thinking about like what is the bigger vision of building a system in some ways from the ground up, and what was just named too about kind of who's at the table building that system. And so I think that's an area, like a growing edge for me as well. And just something to think about is like, you know, oftentimes the legislative process pushes all of us into thinking about, okay, like how can we make this like a little bit better? And that is, there's a space for that. But this kind of challenge, I think, of decolonizing that's being lifted up here is really about like, actually, maybe that system is like, maybe we need to let go of that system and build something new. And really taking the power of legislative leaders and advocates to say, kind of rejecting that way it's always been around incrementalism to wanting to make those bigger changes.
Thank you. So circling back to that question that I had asked Representative Gregerson is, what are some of the barriers within the legislative process that cause a disconnect between legislators and community? And I think this will be a good question to pose with Senator Saldana and then folks like Bernal and Misha and Sumit who work in community as well.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. So, I mean, a few barriers. I mean, just the fact that we are part-time legislators, and our community are experiencing the impacts of our policies all the time. And so I think that is just a barrier in terms of how to access us. And when some of us take on other jobs, or some of us make ourselves more available than others, or are able to. I think also just the fact that we are part-time, so we create this pressure cooker that, you know, where we're 60 days or 120 days, you know, and it works to create like this kind of like bringing things up, creating a tension point, forcing a decision to happen or not happen. But generally that is not really at very, it doesn't allow for a lot of interaction or engagement once we're in. And yet before we're in, it's hard to get a hold of us too. So I think that part is all just, you know, really there. I mean, the other, I mean, past barriers before COVID and before we started all using Zoom was, you know, getting down to Olympia. And I think that's one thing that has been a silver lining, is that we kept on saying it was too hard, we couldn't do it, that wouldn't work with our culture of a state legislature. And you know, this last year we had, you know, so like tenfold in terms of remote testimony and consistent testimony, and people being able to show up from their living rooms and from their coffee shops or from outside. And so I think that is something that a lot of us want to continue, regardless of whether we go do anything in person again, is being able to continue remote testimony. And then, I mean, I think the barriers for real are who can afford, you know, again, like this was a little bit disrupted this year, is who can afford to have someone down there lobbying on your behalf on a consistent basis, and can develop relationships over time, so that even when legislators, you know, we're not there all the time, but agency heads are there all the time, and lobbyist heads are there, and they can have relationships. So when rulemaking happens, like we do the law, but then there's all the details of implementation and rulemaking, and who has the bandwidth to be able to actually see that through at the detail and the attention that it deserves and needs to be able to make it real on the ground. And that has always been a challenge, is like when we fight for a bill, you know, as community or even as a legislator, then to be able to make sure it implements the way that we want to see it, and not just defaults to kind of the lowest common denominator in terms of how this policy and the impact it could have. So those are just a few. There's a lot more, but those are some.
I also think that you know, diversifying the composition of not only the workers that are in Olympia, but also our legislators and legislative assistants and all the personnel that goes around that is really critical, because having to go back, you know, to your community and have to explain what happened in Olympia takes a special kind of a person and a special kind of a presentation, because it's just not being able to translate, you know, what happened in Olympia that can be very difficult to understand sometimes and kind of wonky, and then having it takes a special person to be able to let the community know what exactly happened. And so I think that how are we going to foster that diversity in our personnel? I mean, we have to have trained lobbyists. We have to have community advocates. We have to have you know, legislative assistants working with our legislators of color, and of course we got to diversify our legislative ranks. And until that happens, it's going to be really hard managing any kind of racial equity in Olympia without having the proper hands on deck to be able to guide our legislation through. And I'm always amazed by the power that the number of legislators of color. I'm always amazed by their power in Olympia, because when they do band together and they coalesce and they put something together, it's very powerful and it's meaningful. And I think it's really great to see, particularly women of color, getting into those positions. So it's balancing out that white male dominated culture in Olympia, which I think is again a part of the decolonization that has to take place. There has to be more women involved in those decisions. So I think diversity of staff is really an important key to this.
Thank you, Bernal. Samik or Misha?
Sure, thank you. Thank you, Renika. Yeah, I definitely think when I'm thinking in two ways in terms of like, as nonprofits and as individuals who are organizing with community folks to bring up issues, and then also like my experience being there and with other folks as well at the state legislature, just like meeting with you, Senator Saldana, and others. And my thing is, at the ground level, we need to think about the barriers around capacity building, around capacity building for organizations to develop opportunities to provide like resourceful upscaling and advocacy groups and individuals to persist. Because it really does tie back to the nonprofit industrial complex in terms of funding and who has the funding to be able to support individuals to go and to lobby and to advocate, just like what Dr. Bernal Baca has been talking about and many others. But I'm also thinking about the fact that like Velma has taught us that this system is very protected. That is a protected system and it is a protected space. And we need to, you know, for me, it's like the barrier is that we have to create a strong enough sacred space and sacred movement to support legislators of color and to bring more legislators of color there, because it is that protected system. But then again, going back to like the diversity that Dr. Baca was talking about, I do believe that we need to have language diversity and access. I don't know what that looks like right now, but like even through Zoom and through the online portals, we do have to have a way where there will be, you know, it's accessible for people from different language backgrounds. But at the same time, you know, when we're thinking about the legislature and the government, I'm also thinking about departments and how many times the government and the state works in silos, and within those systems, they operate within their own like bubbles, and that creates a different communication modality that is inherently like very much not offsetting, but it really creates a parameter and a boundary for community to access. And I'm thinking like, how do we actually support the capacity for legislatures? I think it's been said already that, you know, the part that Dr. Baca was talking about diversity for staff and the senator, you were talking about like time and all that. I think it's really important that how do we really expand that to create more capacity to build space for more BIPOC legislature and BIPOC legislation. But I'm also thinking like there's lawmakers that connect with community only during their election time. So what does that mean? Like that's a barrier too. So we have to really configure and reconfigure what the architects are thinking about when they are connecting with community and what that engagement looks like. And then what comes to mind is like legacy relationships. Many times people have relationships that are like already ongoing for the past decades or so. And so how do people who are newcomers, new generation folks that want to be included in this process, folks that are first time advocating or lobbying, how do they get the benefit of what those legacy relationships are? And then the legacy relationships can also be a very big barrier for people because they can be gatekeepers. So how do we deal with that? Because people are making money off of civic processes by being gatekeepers, and the systems prop them up into lobbying efforts, and then it ties back to funding. So I think it's a whole system that is propped up by other avenues of the hierarchy of the state system. And there's a lot of barriers, but I think at the same time, we all know that we're here because we want to make changes and we want to support processes that are beneficial and are efficient for our communities.
Thank you, Samik.
That's Sorry, it's so powerful about what you said about gatekeeping too, and I want to pick up on that thread as it relates to kind of conversations about funding and the budget in the legislative process. And, you know, I think as one of the things that some of my colleagues at the Budget and Policy Center and I have been talking about is this idea, the kind of scarcity mentality that exists around public investments. And, you know, how often do, you know, advocates go and talk to legislators, and like the answer often is probably not from Senator Saldana, who's breaking free of that scarcity mentality, but from others, like, you know, that there's not money, there's just not money. How are you going to pay for it? And, you know, as an organization that works a little bit deeper on the state budget, there is oftentimes like that can be very stifling in terms of like the creative advocacy and this like pressure on advocates to then reduce their funding ask to meet sort of this idea of like what funding is available. And oftentimes, tying to the gatekeeping comment, Samantha, that you made, like there's only a few people that sort of have information about what's going on with the state budget. And often that information is not shared out very broadly, including even by like an organization like mine, the Budget and Policy Center. We may have information about the budget and, you know, haven't always like been as transparent about sharing that out to other community advocates. And when you only have a few people that have that information, it's just, I think it makes it very hard to advocate within that system, and can just be like so stifling to say, well, there's not enough money, instead of really thinking, starting from like, well, what does the actual community need? And then how do we build a budget to match that? And the scarcity piece really like leads to kind of oftentimes like legislators too asking like, oh, well, do you want to fund X or X? And these sort of impossible choices that then are put to other legislators in certain cases, or to advocates to then have to kind of almost like negotiate against yourself down the ask from what is actually needed. And, you know, some of our work is around like the state tax code, and many partners, including EEC and Partners in Change, have been looking at this as well. But about like really how could we have a different conversation when it comes to the state budget? So I feel like some change in that area, but also like naming that dynamic of gatekeeping around access to budget information, and then this like pervasive idea that there's not enough money to invest in our communities, and how that really undermines a lot of the advocacy that is happening, and how that feels to be told that over and over again.
Thank you. So switching gears just a little bit. I know that we've talked about this a lot in our organization, but should anti-racism training be a part of the electoral process?
Yes. Absolutely. Yes.
And I guess to add on to that question is, how do we make that possible?
When you say electoral process, I mean, I guess I'm thinking about like before people run for office, or or are we talking about for voters when they're voting? I mean, that's initially what I thought, but like, can you clear? I mean, and I think yes, and I think that one on who runs and who gets to run, I think there is some hope in this place. There are more community-based organizations that have created their C4s and PACs to educate and prepare our own community to run for office. And so whether that's Sage Leaders, or whether it's One America Votes, or whether it's New American Leaders, or, you know, like Emerge, there's different groups out there. And I think there's opportunity for more, either collaboration to make sure that when they are thinking of running, like, you know, that there is support for them to be prepared and to understand that if you're going to run and you're going to get our endorsement, you need to have an anti-racist lens. You need to have shown that you've done the work, that you're willing to do the work, and continue to be in partnership with folks that are going to hold you accountable. So I think there's that part needs to happen. And also, I mean, this is a place where, you know, Representative Gregerson and Senator Dingra and Morgan, they all passed, helped lead for the Office of Equity, so that our the government folks are starting to move towards making sure that it's integrated in how they do their work. And it's definitely needs to happen then once people are here. And unfortunately, it's become very polarized in terms of only one party is going to participate, and even they, have issues. And I think that's the one thing, is like how we get all folks, regardless of their party, that this needs to happen. And so that's definitely at the state legislature level, the Me Too movement and and updating our policies was part of that in the legislative branch. But in terms of how we take the historically DI work and anti-Blackness and anti-racism, like how we actually get that get that into our schools, get that into a lot of those bills were initiated last year, but in terms of how we actually get it so that it is a requirement regardless of what party you're running and what side of the aisle you're sitting on, is definitely the work that is in the process, but needs a lot of support and encouragement and pushing to make sure that we actually get it done. But yes, the answer is yes.
I would just lift up what Bernal said too earlier about racial equity analysis of legislation. And I think that's really important. And, the racial equity team and Bernal's really led on this to say, like, one-time trainings are always good, but there has to be that kind of ongoing kind of practice. And, I feel like as a white person working in the policy space, like there's a particular responsibility on white folks to take like kind of ownership of their own analysis and learning and, ongoing for me and some of my colleagues at the Budget and Policy Center too. But that practice of actually looking at the legislation through a racial equity lens is like, it's got to be every single day in the legislature, not just like one time at the beginning of session, like checking the box kind of thing.
Thank you, Misha. That's perfectly said.
Thank you. So I wanted to quickly touch on, I know that this has been brought up a few times, is can we expect to keep a virtual legislative session going forward, post-pandemic and everything?
Yeah, well, we know for sure that for committee days, which is when we do the kind of the chairs meet, host meetings and kind of do some initial things that help kind of tee up what might be expected for the next session. That's going to be all remote. And I think that last year, the Senate was really more hybrid. When we were there was a small portion of us on the floor whenever we were voting, and then others participated through Zoom. So I think there's a question of how we're trying to do that. I think there's a desire and there's some benefits for in-person, as we all know, in terms of just the important that we are relational people, we are communal people. The more that we can, when we're in a room together and can feel each other's energy, we can get through compromise and collaboration. But I think a lot of us, especially on committee meetings, will never go back to not being able to allow for remote testimony. And I think the question is, how can we keep our staff safe? And how can we keep constituents safe if we have people that continue to, as the pandemic continues on, and not everyone has equal access to vaccination, not everyone believes in vaccination, and so that is our concern. So hearing from community and hearing from advocacy groups about what you think makes the most sense is very helpful. I mean, leadership, so who makes the decision is what we call, is a small group of, it's a bipartisan group, so it's the leaders of the Senate and Republican caucuses, and then we each have 2 representatives on what we call F&O, finance and operations. So they're the ones that will make the final decision for the Senate, and then on the House side, it's similar. It's the Speaker is key to making the decision on their side. So if you have strong opinions, let them know. It's Senator Dingra, Senator Billig, and Senator Elias, and Senator Hasagawa that represent for us on that committee. And but right now I do know for sure committee days will be remote.
Thank you. So, and I know that you, Senator Saldana had mentioned this in your previous answer, talking about just different parties and the roles that they play. To truly decolonize education, should we have a broader party system?
Well, I mean, I think it's I don't know. You know, there's lots of democracy is definitely still an experiment. I think that at the local level, I personally see value in whether it's ranked choice voting, which is Representative Harris Talley has taken up the charge of leading at the legislative level to move that. If it's allowing all parents and all taxpayers to be able to vote on school boards and at local races. I mean, I think that decolonizing education and the party system, I mean, I just find the question very intriguing. And so I think making sure that people can participate in democracy. And I think that for me personally, I think about this a lot, you know, in terms of what we call, what I see in terms of we are the global majority already, and in many parts of our state, we already have majority minority decision making and participation. But what I see is, you know, white fear holding all of us back, and I think so. I think about it as, for me, whether it's democracy, you know, I think about communalism, and you know, and people have their parties, but I think about, like, at the end of the day, how are the people on the farthest edges? How many are the most, you know, whether it's our elders, whether it is queer youth, whether it is, you know, our Black mothers and parents and kids, like, how are we doing for them? You know, and how is our community, or how does the system work? And if it's not working for them, what I fear is majority coming out of rage or fear. Either of those majorities don't make good policy for humanity and for our earth and for long-term, like, they don't have that vision. They're making it out of fear. And so I know, and I believe, the more women we have in office, the more queer folks we have in office, the more multi-generational mix we have in office, the better we're going to get policy. And so I'm, you know, I heard on the radio recently, it was like the singer, she's like, the opposite of division is not unity, it's collaboration. And so I think when I think about it, like, it's not so much about a party, like, you have, because you have Democrats and Republicans, and then in that Democrat, you have 100 parties. If you've been, you know, like, there's diversity still there, which is part of, you know, some of the criticism of the Democrats, that, you know, we're not unified, we're not, well, it's because we're trying to be reflective of the diversity of our community. And so, so I don't know if it's 100 parties, because some countries have that or not. So I mean, so I'll defer to other smarter people in this room that have been studying democracies, and which is it? Is it a number of parties that make the difference, or is it about really thinking about holding money and holding corporations accountable to being responsive and reflective of the value that we bring as a democracy, and being able to operate in a democracy, making sure that they're paying their fair share and that they are not holding us back. So I think to decolonize education, we need to make sure that it is responsive to community, and we need to hold money in the hands of people, and it needs to be responsive to people, not to one person being able to amass as much wealth as they can. That's for me more what we need for decolonizing education.
You know, I think it's interesting, Senator, that you, of course, I know that you have a Chicano studies background too, so your history's coming out, but I was reviewing some history just the other day around Rudy Corky Gonzalez, who wrote an epic poem, of course, I Am Joaquin, and talked about being confused in a world of Anglo society. I looked at that because back in the day, in the 60s and 70s, the Chicanos back in the day actually left the Democratic Party and started their own party, the La Raza Unida Party, through Jose Angel Gutierrez. And then, of course, it went up through Denver through Corky's organization. But I was looking at that, and what they were talking about back in the day, and these were Chicanos that were disenfranchised with the Democrats because they were trying to play the Democratic politics, but they weren't being allowed to fully participate. They decided to start their own party, and it took quite a while for the Democrats to corral that group back into the Democratic Party fold. It's not. We're not foreign to the idea of leaving a party to join a new party. I mean, you know what I mean? We've been there already, and I think that if you kind of look at history from that perspective, that why did we want to leave back in the day? And it was because we didn't have active full participation, and we felt left out. And this was the party that said, we will include you, but it didn't happen fast enough. So I just kind of look at our historical being of since decolonization, it really is a word rooted in deep history. All of us have had colonized backgrounds, and so coming from that background and knowing how that we've been colonized, my people have been colonized so many times that we've taken on not only new identities, but have switched from being the oppressed to becoming the oppressors. And so it's like we've done both. And how do you rectify in this schematic that we're talking about today of decolonization? I mean, what does that really mean? And so this topic today meant a lot to me because it made me do a little bit of digging into my own personal roots and look in my background of how was I colonized, and what brought me to the point where I am today, where there's a serious conflict in my identity growing up, and having to rectify that, and hoping that we're getting to a point now that we can actually discuss it, which is more gratifying to me that we are having a discussion like this. Well, whereas 30 years ago, we were trying to push to have these kinds of discussions. So anyway, just reflecting on a little bit of the historical past on the term decolonization.
Dr. Baca, you got me reflecting too. Thank you. So I'm reflecting on the immigration process that got me and my family here, and a lot of folks that came from Southeast Asia, but also the very marginal communities like the Garifuna community, right? The Hmong Mien Lao community. Like maybe our smaller communities do not see ourselves reflected in the two-party system. And that's where the wedge is at, and that's why people are not engaged. And also, I'll speak from my community experience. My elders are still stuck in our politics in Cambodia. So they organize on the weekends. They call France, Australia. They do their organizing, they do their civic engagement, but not for our civics here in the state of Washington. They do it for a country of origin. And so, and part of that, I think, is because they don't see themselves reflected in this two-party system that we live in right now. And I think that's kind of the main, sorry, I'm kind of going off tangent here, but kind of the main thing is why people are not as engaged. But also going back to you know, what the senator was talking about, I honestly think that corporations are making, like we all know, they're making huge sums of money for us, like trying to figure out how to navigate the system. I mean, one thing we're coming up against is, you know, government trying to help and include workers to go to Amazon to get, you know, employment. And the broader issue that they should be talking about is, why are they even being a recruiting agency for Amazon? And why aren't they fighting for the full funds and money, you know, Misha, you know this, like that they owe us, that they have been looting from the public, that these corporations have been taking from the public. So I think it's like, it's a hard, yeah, I'm just trying to respond back to what both of you have been talking about, because those are things we're dealing with here too at Partners in Change and at the ground level. And it's really complex. So there's no like straight answer to that, but we do want to recognize that, you know, the two-party system for my community oftentimes leaves people out.
Thank you, Sumit and Dr. Baca. Question from the chat from Charlotte, really good question. Are all of our legislators required to have tribal government-to-government training? Learning about the tribal history of our state and about tribal sovereignty strikes me as equally important as anti-racist training for all of our legislators. Thank you for that question, Charlotte.
Yeah, it is a good question. Thankfully, and again, like this wasn't always the case, but when Senator McCoy was the caucus chair when I came in, and so he made sure that he worked with the Secretary of the Senate, who is our kind of, you know, runs the back of the house of everything, to make sure that my class that came in got at least a 101, but it's like an hour and a half, you know, it's an hour thing that I got exposed to and realized how little I know. And it's huge. And I don't think it is required. It really is dependent on who's the leadership, who provides that, and openness. So I think those are the kinds of things that I think we can definitely make sure that it continues to be base knowledge when someone gets onboarded. But when someone comes in through an appointment and isn't there on the regular cycle, sometimes they don't get that full opportunity either. And so again, you know, these are the kinds of things when people are running for office, the more that we're building in into candidate trainings is also really important. And yeah, I mean, so it isn't, but I think it is something that I'm committed to making sure that we'll work with the House and the Senate to make sure that it's incorporated into all the onboarding process.
Thank you. And another question in the chat is a thank you to Senator Saldana. Building on the need for money to be responsive to people. One of our barriers to effectively serve our students in our district is the current way schools are funded. What is the outlook for reimagining the prototypical school funding model to be one that is based on student wholeness and equity over enrollment? Would love insight on how to effectively advocate and collaborate on this.
I think there's a lot more educator expertise here, but what I'll say is I don't know that there is not a current one that I know of in terms of totally undoing the prototypical model. But I do think there's a few things. One is there's a lot of good work happening, and this goes, in terms of how levy funding is and how PTAs or PTSAs work, because this all goes back to redlining. It all goes back to the banks. It all goes back to slavery and racism, and that was embedded in the founding of our country and the founding of our public education system. And Washington is not immune at all to this. But so I think there is, in terms of how we pool resources, how we make sure that they're distributed to meet to where the need is. And I think that through this pandemic, at least in my local communities, of really talking about what it means to have culturally centered, true ethnic curriculum throughout K through 12, not just this one class, but how are our youth seeing themselves and the brilliance of our communities reflected in their curriculum, whatever it is, whether it's math or science. And so I think that piece is there. In terms of funding, I mean, I think it continues with the bigger conversation of writing our upside down tax code. And we did make a small dent in there. Now we have to defend it at the courts with capital gains coming through. But we, the work that Representative Noel Frame is part of, and Senator Willman is our representative for the Senate. She has opened herself up to continue to be a learner in this space, which I love, because she's one of our more senior members, and the fact that she shows up in a willingness to learn is something that I hope that I continue to do as I keep walking on this earth. But is pushing that we need to actually fully fund what it means to have good government, and that gets to this idea of, like, it can't be about scarcity. It needs to be about meeting the needs of and what we're being called to address, the real issues that needs to be solved for. So I think in general, what I would say, and I've always told people, is if you're going to come asking for money, also ask, make sure that you are weighing in on tax reform and making sure that everyone's paying their fair share, closing those loopholes, and making sure that we are actually collecting so that it's not a burden on people, and that we have the revenues to be able to invest in communities. So that's a little bit, I would definitely defer to some of the others, that have some solutions too, that I need to be pushing for.
Thank you for that insight. So I wanted to go back. How do you, when we're thinking about policy, how do you educate the grassroots Vince legislators on a particular issue?
Say that question again, just.
How do you, we're talking about policy, how do you educate the grassroots on like a policy, Vince, like how legislators are educated on the particular issue?
Well, this goes back to what I talked about earlier, which is really having I think a good communication person between the legislator and the community. I think there has to be some kind of liaison there that can take the legislative jargon and then help make sense of it at the community level. And I'm not saying that the community can't understand things. I'm just saying that sometimes the jargon is so inside baseball talk that it can get lost in the interpretation. So I think that's again where it's really good having this racial equity lens person that can not only understand the legislative process, but actually understand the needs of the community, so that they can make a kind of an interpretation of what's going on. And I don't know if that helps answer your question, Renika, but to me, it really goes back to that again, is being able to bridge that gap between the two, because sometimes the communication can be broken down and it can be misinterpreted. And it's all because there's more of an inside discussion about it that sometimes the people in the community don't understand it. It doesn't make sense to them because the stuff that's happening in Olympia happens in real time. And by the time it gets communicated to the folks in the community, it could be a week later. And a lot of time could elapse and interpretation can be made because of that. And I know, Misha, I'm looking at you, I know that we've always been put in that position of having to be the carrier of the water sometimes for stuff that's actually being said in Olympia, and then how do we roll that out and have it make sense in the community?
Yeah, I think that the thing that's kind of coming up for me is not directly responsive to the question, but sort of holding like that labor that is particularly being held by BIPOC legislators and advocates who are kind of in this go-between, right? And how to, like, I think I've had that experience where particularly women of color in the legislature, including Senator Saldana, are like really going and talking to maybe some of the more hostile legislators, coming back, meeting with community members, and kind of going between. And it's a really incredibly like important and powerful role, but also like just holding like how much that is to ask, and thinking about advocates in that too. And Dr. Baca, what you said before about like power in numbers, like not having that all be on one person's shoulders, and also thinking about like how we ensure that there's funding for those types of roles and that people are supported in them, which feels like, you know, oftentimes there's like pretty high burnout among advocates and legislators. I see that too, where like folks maybe are, you know, compelled to get more involved, but it can be like a really rough on the heart doing that. And then folks kind of can't stick with it, right? Especially BIPOC communities who are bearing all of that labor. And so I'm just kind of holding like, how do we make sure that that work is like supported? Because I don't think, you know, this question's kind of like, for me, I'm like, yeah, you know, I could as a white person, like think about what is, you know, the messaging for one like audience of legislators and then community advocates, but it's not going to be nearly as like effective or impactful as the work that people from different communities are doing as we like travel between these different worlds. And so I don't know, just kind of like holding that, and also like holding how like the conversations in the legislature feel like during my time as an advocate, like it's shifted. It used to be that it felt like, you know, oh, don't talk about race, like don't name racial disparities, you know, like we have to figure out how to sell everything to like the most conservative white man who's been in the legislature for a really long time. And the power is shifting, and the work that has been named already about representation and who's at the table making decisions, and like this work is really underway. And you can tell that like that's allowed sort of a, you know, legislators really talking about, for example, like doing racial equity analyses, like that is like a caucus, you know, could be a caucus priority as opposed to something a few folks are working on and really pushing from the outside. So I don't know, I just like feel a little bit of a shifting and an opportunity there too, to continue to move that forward, so that it doesn't have to be like two sets of messages, like one for this sort of exclusive group of like powerful, largely white men, and then one message that resonates with everyone else, because that's not necessarily leading to the best policy outcomes.
Yeah, and I think, you know, everything you guys said, I mean, obviously, Misha and Bernal have seen me and before me, right, the few people that were there before. And so, but as the numbers have changed, I think it is about, hopefully there's less of what I used to always talk, even when I was doing advocacy as a BIPAC, doing advocacy to the city back in the time, where, you know, I basically say we're shapeshifters, and that is our superpower, is being able to go and talk to the white folks, make them feel less, you know, worried about it, and then go back and talk to our community and make sure that they feel empowered, and then making sure that you actually take time to shift back into your real self. It was, you know, the work that I did with Puget Sound Sage on the outside, and then, you know, coming here and making sure that we're staying grounded is really important. But you know, and I think this is a moment where taking space, claiming that space, and then making sure, like, you know, that we're keeping an open place to allow folks to be thinking differently about how they think about legislation and that policy. But there is still the real backlash, and there is still the other party, and so I think that is a tension that I'm always kind of trying to make sure I'm learning from community, and also making sure that I am pushing as much as I can on myself too, to stop doing that shape shifting. But I think that has been for the first generation of women that came in, like they were more mothers.
We're losing you a little bit, Senator Saldana.
Gave me this opportunity. I'm now in the place where
Senator Saldana, I believe you cut out. All right, we will come back to that. I did want to go back and kind of touch on the just kind of like community and like what Bernard said about or Dr. Bach, excuse me, about bridging like the gap between community and government. Is what do you think is the best way for Indigenous / colonized folks to approach legislation / government leaders, their colonizers, for reparations?
Best approach. Well, I think, you know, again, having done this for so many years, I think the best approach is being authentic, and also, you know, building that relationship. I mean, I think every year in the state legislature, the years that people put into it is money in the bank for many people, because their word and their integrity precedes them. And I think that's what you really, if you're really going to get into the game in Olympia, I think that's really where you're going to have to place your hat, because you know, if you think you're just going to go in and shake it up and change it and then leave whenever you want and start again, it doesn't work that way. It all comes down to relationship building. And, you know, again, I have to look at, I know I keep calling on you, Misha, and I would do it with the senators also. But, you know, we've been around long enough to know that your name means a lot in Olympia. You know, when Misha walks into a room and she may be representing an organization, but she also brings her integrity into the room with her, which means that she's pretty much has established a good rapport and relationships with people. So, you know, I guess this is kind of at the point where you kind of giving advice to people that if you're thinking about entering into this arena at any level, you know, your integrity is the most important part of this cog, because you've got to maintain that integrity in order to be effective. Once you have shown that you don't have integrity, and then, you know, you lose years of experience in Olympia. So my take on it is, if you really want to move something, it may take a few years, because it means, you know, you when you think about it, honestly, you've got a lot of convincing to do with not only the legislators, but your own community and your own stakeholders. So your integrity is very important.
That's really kind. And I think the question too, like, you know, I'm in like really no position to tell folks like how to do advocacy, especially as like a white person in this space. And I just want to lift up what Senator Saldana said at the beginning about like resisting the way things have always been. Because I think that a lot of times there is like, there can be like oh yeah, here are the ways to like navigate the legislative process. And there's a lot of expertise and people like Dr. Baca and others, who all the members of the racial equity team, like people who have experience to share, the leaders in the Equity and Education Coalition. And at the same time, like there's a need to build, like to change it, right? To build something different. And that will require like new strategies and new ways of doing things. And so, you know, I think I will just say like too, I feel like there's sometimes I think like advocacy can feel a little bit lonely, like, and like Bernal just said, like it can take a while sometimes, right? And that can be a little bit demoralizing, but there's like actually a whole community of folks working to change things that can feel, one like downside of the virtual environment is sometimes you can feel a little less connected with that community because we can't have in-person lobby days. We can't do things in ways where we're seeing each other face to face, but there are these amazing coalitions and resources like Equity and Education Coalition, Partners in Change, Racial Equity Team, the Members of Color Caucus, like people working in these powerful ways to join together with. So that feels like very important to me, I guess.
Thank you. How can we reconcile our desire to decolonize our state with the reality that our capital exists on colonized / stolen lands? I think that in the Equity and Education Coalition, we've, especially with planning our Decolonizing Education Conference, we've talked a lot about just like, how do you decolonize a system that was used to colonize within? And like, can you do it from within? Is it possible, or does it have to come from the outside? And I think, you know, this is also a big question, is how do we reconcile with this when, you know, this whole entity we're talking about exists in a colonized manner?
Well, I think for me, the first step in decolonization is really understanding what that means to that particular group of people. I mean, and if we're talking about Olympia and the grounds that Olympia was built on, there definitely needs to be a historical context put into that. I know that in the Pritchard building, if you go downstairs into the building itself, there is a historical framework of paintings that surround the inner lining of the bottom library there, and it depicts a lot of the history of colonization that took place back in the day. And I think that kind of history needs to be brought forward. I think we need to understand it better so that we can understand why we're acting the way we're acting and doing what we're doing, and understanding why people respond to the way they respond. I don't think we have a true appreciation of that. I think we don't look at what's happened to our ancestral families close enough to see the value that history has to offer us in terms of shaping our future. So I always go back to researching what our history tells us, and what did our ancestors tell us, and what are those stories that we need to be brought forward to, so that we could recognize why we're in existence and why we do have polarization and I mean, you think about all the cultural genocide and the acculturation and assimilation process that took place through centuries of institutionalized racism. I mean, it was horrific, and so we're stigmatized by all that. But yeah, that's where I would begin, is really doing a good job of educating people about the history, and not everyone likes history. Nobody. I notice that people like to avoid the big history question because either they didn't teach it properly, or people got bored with it in high school. I don't know what happened. We're not learning history, and now the history we're teaching seems to be inaccurate.
Thank you, Dr. Baca. What is the most important thing that white legislators could do right now to be allies in the work in pushing this movement forward? And Misha, did you want to touch on that? Or Representative?
Yeah, I was just,
thank you.
Yeah, I don't know if Senator Saldana, if you want to jump in before me, go ahead, because I know you're on the phone.
Well, I mean, I think it goes back. It goes back to what I talked about earlier. Is their commitment? Can you guys hear me? No.
Yes.
Oh, okay. Yeah, what I was going to say is that, I mean, I think part of it is, leaning into the work of understanding the history and uncovering the history. Like there's, an easy and accessible book, Heather McGee's The Sum of Us, that goes through and looks at, why can't we have nice things? And so having them do their work, I think also, there's a couple conversations that white folks and all of us need to have around what you were talking about earlier around our sovereign rights and indigenous populations that have not recognized in Washington state of white supremacy and how it's tied to anti-Semitism, and how part of decolonizing means decolonizing ourselves, and that is ongoing work, because as Bernal was talking, as Dr. Baca was talking about earlier, I mean, my history, my story, my experience is not all liberation, and that I have my own internal work to do to decolonize my mind and the way that I think, and because I was raised here, and my family history is varied, and so I think that's what I would say of our white folks too, is to break things down and to make sure that we're going deeper. It's not just because the word equity is there, it's how are we undoing, as was said earlier, some of this and uprooting the piece that keeps us all less whole. And at the same time, do it in a way that we're building scaffolding so it doesn't all implode. I mean, I do think that the institutions of and the idea of democracy, as imperfect as it is the best that I've seen across the globe in the little history I have done in terms of how we govern ourselves. And so I want a republic and a democracy to continue to move forward. I don't want it to implode, but we need to make sure that we do a whole rehaul and remodel in a way that does not have that implosion happen, but allows us to transform the work while we're living in the building still.
Thank you, Senator Saldana.
Yeah, I would add, and just like, you know, definitely like +1 to everything Senator Saldana just said. And like, I think that like as a white person working in this space, like there's a lot of work that I as an advocate need to do. And, you know, I think even earlier talking about like who was kind of, who was sort of doing the labor of like navigating these different communication channels, like there's a lot of like extra work that BIPOC folks in advocacy and in the legislature are doing. And so I think, I guess I feel always like the importance, and I'm always like learning about like, what is the work that I need to take on in this space? And there is like really important, like learning history work, really like unpacking white supremacy and how that shows up in me as a white person, really thinking about like educating and working with other white folks. Like there's like so much there that it's like almost hard to think of where to even begin in giving direction to a white legislator. But, you know, I think one of the things I kind of hold a little bit is the Ibram X. Kendi framing around anti-racism and the idea that like we have to choose every day and act. I'm not like quoting accurately, but like kind of choose every day and act in a way that's moving us towards anti-racism. And I think that challenge is like particularly there for white folks who often can feel like, okay, I'll sit on the sidelines or I'm neutral. And there's really no like neutrality in this space. There's really no, like, if we're not acting towards anti-racism, like we're part of the problem. And I think it's just a constant challenge, and like also following the lead of leaders of color in this space, like Senator Saldana, for white legislators, like definitely do what the members of Color Caucus and other members are offering, and continue that learning. So I don't know, some things there to add in.
Thank you, Misha. So, yes, thank you. I just wanted to open up. I know that our panelists have had to slowly drop off with other meetings and things going on, but if there was any comments or any questions that can be answered from folks who are still left on the call, please feel free to unmute yourself and speak. Alrighty, so just a few announcements. I wanted to first announce that as most of you all probably know, we do have our Decolonizing Education Conference coming up November 3rd through the 5th. It is a virtual conference due to the pandemic. And this is what the whole series was about, was kind of prepping folks and really getting those questions out there and having these conversations leading up to our conference. I'm gonna drop the link to our conference website in the chat. If you haven't heard about it and you wanna check it out, please do. Feel free to email myself or the conference email. If you have any questions, I will drop those in the chat as well. And then a couple other things that we have our last Lunch and Learn of the Decolonizing Education series, as well as our last Lunch and Learn for the 2021 year will be on October 20th, and that will be Decolonizing the Social Framework. We are really looking forward to that and just being gathered again for one last amazing conversation before the year is over. And as a lot of y'all may know, our Velma Valoria did retire this past week. She will also be on that call, but if you're wondering why she was missing today, it's her birthday, so she's out having a good old time. And lastly, Samate Mel, who is one of our panelists, is the director of our program Partners in Change here at the EEC. We will be having a candidates forum on October 20th, right after that Lunch and Learn. And we will be covering the King County executive race, as well as the King County District 5 race and the Seattle mayoral race. And I will drop that link if you would like to sign up to be a part of that discussion as well. I believe that is all the announcements I have. Again, thank you so much again for joining us. I know I see some familiar faces. This was a great conversation, and I hope to see all of y'all at our last Lunch and Learn on October 20th. Thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of the afternoon.